The blizzard came without warning, howling across the Colorado plains like a vengeful spirit, turning the world white in a matter of hours. Parker Thomas pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he urged his horse forward through the deepening snow. He'd been a fool to ride out to check his fence line with a storm brewing, but being a widowed father had made him cautious about his small ranch. It was all he had left to provide for his 6-year-old son, Matthew. The wind cut through him like a knife as visibility dropped to nearly nothing. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, snorted in protest as they pushed onward. Parker knew these lands well. His modest spread lay just 3 miles outside Los Animas, Colorado, where he'd settled 5 years ago after his wife Sarah died in childbirth. "Just a little further, boy," he murmured to the horse, the words immediately stolen by the wind. That's when he saw it, a dark shape against the endless white. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks, but as he drew closer the shape became clearer, a person half buried in a snowdrift. Parker dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the snow as he trudged toward the figure. It was a woman, her face pale as the snow around her, lips tinged with blue. Dark hair spilled out from beneath a woolen cap, and her clothes, good quality but not suited for this weather, were soaked through. He pressed his fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. Relief flooded through him. "Madam, can you hear me?" Parker called, gently shaking her shoulder. No response. Without hesitation, he scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected and deathly cold. Carrying her to his horse, he somehow managed to mount with her cradled against his chest. There was no time to waste. The ranch was closer than town. And in this weather, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. As they rode through the blinding snow, Parker couldn't help but wonder who this woman was and what she was doing out here alone in a blizzard. Los Animas wasn't exactly on the main routes west. Strangers were uncommon, especially well-dressed women traveling alone. By the time his modest ranch house came into view, the woman still hadn't stirred. Parker's son would be inside with Mrs. Abernathy, the widow from the neighboring property who looked after Matthew when Parker had to work the land. "Pa," Matthew called the moment Parker pushed through the door with the unconscious woman in his arms. The boy's eyes widened at the sight. "Who is that?" "Found her in the snow," Parker explained quickly. "Mrs. Abernathy, I need hot water and all the blankets we can spare." The older woman moved quickly, her efficiency born from years of frontier living. "Put her by the fire. Those clothes need to come off, they're soaked through." Parker hesitated only momentarily before nodding. "Matthew, go fetch more wood for the fire, please." As his son scurried out the back door to the woodpile under the lean-to, Parker and Mrs. Abernathy worked to remove the woman's sodden outer garments. Beneath her traveling coat, she wore a simple but well-made dress of deep blue wool. No wedding ring adorned her finger, but around her neck hung a silver locket. Mrs. Abernathy clucked her tongue. "She's lucky you found her, Mr. Thomas. Not many survive being caught in a blizzard like this." Parker nodded grimly as they wrapped her in warm blankets and positioned her near the crackling fire. Her face was striking even in unconsciousness, strong features, high cheekbones, and long dark lashes that cast shadows on her pale cheeks. "I'll brew some willow bark tea for when she wakes," Mrs. Abernathy said. "She'll likely have a fierce headache from the cold." Hours passed. Mrs. Abernathy reluctantly departed once the snow let up slightly, needing to return to her own home before dark. Parker sat vigil by the woman's side, occasionally checking her pulse, relieved to find it growing stronger. Matthew had long since fallen asleep in his small bedroom when Parker noticed her eyelids beginning to flutter. He leaned forward, watching as awareness slowly returned to her face. Her eyes opened a startling shade of green that reminded Parker of spring grass and immediately filled with confusion and alarm. She tried to sit up, only to fall back with a groan. "Easy now," Parker said softly. "You're safe. Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but cultured, with a slight Eastern accent. "Who are you?" "My name is Parker Thomas. You're at my ranch outside Los Animas. I found you unconscious in the snow during the blizzard." She stared at him, clearly trying to make sense of his words. "Los Animas, Colorado territory." Parker nodded. Yes, madam, may I ask your name? She hesitated, then seemed to decide he meant her no harm. Tessa Northwood. What were you doing out in that storm, Miss Northwood? A shadow crossed her face. I was traveling to Santa Fe. The stagecoach stopped in Las Animas, and the driver said the storm was coming but wouldn't delay us more than a day. I went for a walk to stretch my legs while they changed horses. She trailed off, her brow furrowing. I must have gotten disoriented when the snow started. I remember trying to find my way back to town, but everything looked the same. Parker offered her a cup of the willow bark tea that had been keeping warm by the fire. You're lucky to be alive. That storm came on faster and harder than anyone expected. Their fingers brushed as she took the cup, and Parker felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. It had been 5 years since Sarah died, 5 years of focusing solely on raising Matthew and keeping their small ranch afloat. He'd forgotten what it felt like, that simple human connection. Tessa sipped the tea carefully, grimacing at the bitter taste. Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Thomas. Parker, please. A small smile touched her lips. Parker. The sound of his name in her voice stirred something inside him that he thought had died with Sarah. Parker cleared his throat and stood abruptly. You should rest. We can figure out getting you back to town when the weather clears. But the weather had other plans. By morning, 3 feet of snow blanketed the landscape, with drifts twice that height. Las Animas might as well have been on the moon. Tessa stood at the window, wrapped in one of Parker's old flannel shirts and a blanket, looking out at the transformed world. I've never seen so much snow, she said, wonder in her voice. Parker came to stand beside her, acutely aware of her presence. The path to town will be blocked for at least a few days, maybe a week. She turned to him, concern evident in her expression. I don't want to impose, you're not, he assured her quickly. We have plenty of supplies, and it's not like we can do much ranching in this weather anyway. Matthew chose that moment to burst into the room, his small face alight with excitement. Pa, can I build a snow fort, please? Parker chuckled. After breakfast, and only if you stay where I can see you from the window. Matthew noticed Tessa then, suddenly shy. He half hid behind his father's leg. Are you the snow lady? Tessa's laugh was warm and genuine. Snow lady, Pa said he found you in the snow like magic. Parker felt his ears grow hot. Matthew, but Tessa was already kneeling to the boy's level. Not quite magic. Just very, very lucky that your father found me. She held out her hand. I'm Tessa. Matthew shook her hand solemnly. I'm Matthew Thomas. I'm 6. Very pleased to meet you, Mr. Matthew Thomas. The formality made the boy giggle, his shyness evaporating. Do you like snow forts? And just like that, Tessa Northwood was drawn into their small family circle. After breakfast, a simple but hearty meal of cornmeal mush with molasses and salt pork. Parker bundled Matthew into his warmest clothes. To his surprise, Tessa asked if she could join them outside. Are you sure you're up to it? Parker asked, concern evident in his voice. You were half frozen just yesterday. I feel much better, she insisted, and some fresh air would do me good. So Parker found her some old clothes of Sarah's that he hadn't been able to part with, woolen trousers, a heavy sweater, thick socks, and boots. They were a bit short on Tessa's taller frame, but they would keep her warm. Outside, the world sparkled under a bright blue sky, the storm having moved eastward overnight. Matthew immediately set about building his fort while Parker kept one eye on him and the other on Tessa, who was walking carefully through the snow, marveling at the transformed landscape. You said you're from back east, Parker asked, coming to stand beside her. She nodded. Boston. This is my first time west of the Mississippi. What takes you to Santa Fe, if you don't mind my asking? Tessa was quiet for a moment, watching Matthew pack snow into blocks. A fresh start, she finally said. My father passed away 6 months ago. He left some debts, and our house had to be sold. I have a cousin in Santa Fe who offered me a position in her millinery shop. Parker heard what she wasn't saying, that she had nowhere else to go, no other family to turn to. I'm sorry about your father, she shrugged, but he could see the grief in her eyes. Life moves on, doesn't it? We adapt or we perish. Like being caught in a blizzard, he said softly. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared experience despite their different backgrounds. The moment was broken by a snowball hitting Parker squarely in the back. He turned to find Matthew doubled over with laughter. "Oh, you think that's funny, do you?" Parker scooped up a handful of snow. "We'll see who's laughing now." What followed was an epic snowball fight, with Tessa quickly joining Matthew's side against Parker. Her laughter rang out across the snow-covered yard, clear and bright as a bell. Parker couldn't remember the last time he'd heard such a joyful sound on his property. By mid-afternoon, they were all exhausted and soaked through. They retreated inside, where Parker stoked up the fire and set water to boil for hot cocoa, a rare treat he usually saved for special occasions. As Tessa helped Matthew out of his wet clothes, Parker was struck by how naturally she fit into their small home, as if she'd always been there. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. That evening, after Matthew was tucked into bed, Parker and Tessa sat before the fire. The wind had picked up again outside, whistling around the eaves of the house, but inside all was warm and quiet. "He's a wonderful boy," Tessa said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You've done a fine job raising him." Parker stared into the flames. "I try, it's not always easy doing it alone." "His mother," Tessa asked softly, "died bringing him into the world." The pain had dulled over the years, but it never truly went away. "We were young, barely 20, came west with big dreams." He smiled ruefully. "Reality turned out to be a lot more difficult than the dream." Tessa nodded in understanding. "Dreams usually are." "What about you?" Parker asked, turning to look at her. The firelight cast a golden glow over her features. "Any family besides your cousin?" "No, my mother died when I was 12. It was just father and me after that." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I was engaged once, 2 years ago. He broke it off when a better prospect came along, a banker's daughter with a substantial dowry." The bitterness in her voice told Parker the wound was still fresh. "His loss," he said simply. She glanced up, surprised, then smiled. "Thank you for saying that." They talked long into the night, sharing stories of their lives, Parker's childhood in Illinois, his journey west with Sarah, the struggles and joys of building a life in Colorado territory. Tessa told him about growing up in Boston, her father's business as a bookbinder, her love of literature and art. "I used to dream of Paris," she admitted, "of seeing the Louvre and walking along the Seine." "Maybe you still will someday," Parker suggested. Tessa shook her head. "Those were a girl's dreams. I'm a woman now, and I need to be practical." Something in her resigned tone made Parker's heart ache. He recognized it all too well, the slow death of dreams in the face of harsh reality. The next morning brought more snow, lighter than before but steady. Parker went out to tend to the livestock in the barn, grateful that he'd stocked up on feed before the storm hit. When he returned to the house, he found Tessa teaching Matthew his letters at the kitchen table. "Pa," Matthew exclaimed, "Miss Tessa knows all kinds of big words. She's helping me with my reading." "Is that so?" Parker hung his coat by the door, stomping the snow from his boots. "You're in good hands then. Miss Tessa went to school in Boston." "What's Boston like?" Matthew asked, wide-eyed. Tessa described the city to him, the harbor filled with ships from all over the world, the narrow cobblestone streets, the grand buildings of brick and stone. Matthew listened, enthralled, and Parker found himself equally captivated, not just by the images she painted but by the animation in her face as she spoke. Days passed, and the snow began to melt. The road to Las Animas would soon be passable again, and Parker found himself dreading the moment when Tessa would leave. She had become a part of their daily life with surprising ease. Matthew adored her, following her around like a puppy, soaking up the attention she lavished on him. And Parker. Parker was increasingly aware that his feelings for Tessa had grown far beyond simple friendship. One evening, after Matthew was asleep, Parker found Tessa mending one of his shirts by the fire. The domesticity of the scene made his throat tighten. "You don't have to do that," he said, taking a seat across from her. She looked up with a smile. "I don't mind, it's the least I can do for your hospitality." "Saving your life is hardly hospitality," Parker pointed out. "Anyone would have done the same, would they?" Tessa's hands stilled on the fabric. "I'm not so sure. The world isn't always kind to women alone." There was a story there, Parker sensed, but he didn't press. Instead, he said, "The snow's nearly melted on the south slope." Another day or two and the road to town should be clear enough for travel. Oh, her voice was small. Yes, I suppose I should inquire about the stage to Santa Fe. Neither spoke for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Finally, Parker cleared his throat. Or you could stay. Tessa's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Stay, just until spring, he hurried to add, suddenly unsure of himself. The winter travel can be dangerous, and Matthew would miss you terribly. Just Matthew? The question was barely audible. Parker met her gaze directly. No, not just Matthew. The honesty of his response hung between them, fragile as blown glass. Tessa's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at the shirt in her lap. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Say you'll think about it, Parker suggested, his heart hammering in his chest. That's all I ask. She nodded slowly. I'll think about it. The next day, Parker hitched up the sleigh, a contraption he rarely used but kept for severe winters, and prepared to take Tessa into Los Animas. She needed to check on her trunk, which had been left at the stage coach office, and send a telegram to her cousin explaining the delay. Matthew was inconsolable when he realized Tessa might not return. But you have to come back, he wailed, clinging to her skirts. Who's going to help me with my reading? Tessa knelt down, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'll be back, Matthew, I promise. I just need to take care of a few things in town. The boy sniffled. Really promise, really promise. She held out her pinky finger, and Matthew linked his with hers solemnly. The trip to Los Animas was quiet, both Parker and Tessa lost in their own thoughts. The town was just beginning to dig out from the blizzard, with shopkeepers clearing paths to their doors and teamsters working to break through the drifts on the main street. At the stage coach office, they learned that service to Santa Fe had been suspended until further notice due to impassable conditions further south. Might be 2-3 weeks, the agent told them, scratching his beard. Maybe longer if we get another storm. Tessa bit her lip, clearly calculating her options. Is there a hotel in town, somewhere respectable I could stay? The agent snorted. Los Animas ain't exactly Denver, madam. There's the saloon that rents rooms upstairs, but... He trailed off, his implication clear. Parker stepped in. Miss Northwood will be staying with my family until travel resumes, he said firmly. We'd like to retrieve her trunk, please. Outside, as they waited for the trunk to be brought around, Tessa turned to him. You didn't have to do that. I meant what I said yesterday, Parker replied. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, her expression softened. Thank you. They spent the remainder of the day in town, Parker introducing Tessa to the merchants and townspeople he knew. Los Animas was small but growing, situated as it was on the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and the aforementioned saloon. Tessa attracted curious glances. A well-dressed, educated Eastern woman was a rarity in these parts, but the people were generally welcoming. At the general store, Parker purchased supplies while Tessa browsed the limited selection of fabric and notions. He watched her from across the store, the way she moved with an innate grace, the serious consideration she gave to each bolt of cloth she examined. Something warm unfurled in his chest at the sight. That your new woman, Thomas? The question came from Bill Henderson, the store's owner, as he tallied Parker's purchases. Parker felt heat rise to his face. No, she's just staying with us for a while, got caught in the blizzard. Henderson raised an eyebrow. Lucky for her you found her. He lowered his voice. Lucky for you too, maybe. Been too long since Sarah passed, God rest her soul. Boy needs a mother. Parker didn't reply, but the words echoed in his mind as they drove back to the ranch. Matthew did need a mother. And Parker was beginning to realize how lonely he'd been these past 5 years. Matthew was ecstatic when they returned, especially when Tessa assured him she would be staying for at least a few more weeks. That night, she insisted on cooking dinner, a savory stew with dumplings that left both Parker and Matthew asking for seconds. As the days turned into weeks, Tessa seamlessly integrated into their routine. She took over Matthew's education, establishing regular lessons each morning. In the afternoons, she helped Parker with whatever tasks could be managed in the winter, whether mending harnesses, taking inventory of supplies, planning the spring planting. In the evenings, she read aloud to Matthew before bedtime, her expressive voice bringing tales of far-off adventures to life. Parker found himself looking forward to those quiet hours after Matthew was asleep, when he and Tessa would sit by the fire and talk. Sometimes they discussed practical matters: the ranch, Matthew's education, the prospects for spring. But increasingly, their conversations turned personal, each sharing pieces of themselves they rarely revealed to others. "I never wanted to be a burden to anyone," Tessa confessed one night. "After my father died and I learned about the debts, I felt like such a failure. I should have paid more attention to his business affairs, but he always insisted I not worry about such things." "You couldn't have known," Parker assured her. "And you're not a burden, Tessa, far from it." She gave him a tremulous smile. "Sometimes I think fate brought me to that blizzard. As terrible as it was being lost in the snow, I can't regret where I ended up." Their eyes met, and Parker felt a magnetic pull toward her. Before he could think better of it, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and delicate against his calloused palm. "I'm glad you ended up here too," he said softly. For a moment, it seemed like time stood still. Then Tessa gently squeezed his hand before withdrawing hers. "It's getting late, I should turn in." Parker nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "Of course, good night, Tessa." "Good night, Parker." In the days that followed, something shifted between them. There was a new awareness, a tension that hadn't been there before. Their hands would brush when passing dishes at the table, and both would quickly pull away. Their eyes would meet across the room, only to dart apart when the connection grew too intense. Parker knew he was falling in love with Tessa, and it terrified him. Not just because of the pain he'd experienced losing Sarah, but because he had no idea if Tessa felt the same way. She was kind to him, yes, and they got along well, but she'd never given any clear indication that she saw him as more than a friend and benefactor. As February turned to March, the weather began to warm. The snow melted in earnest, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. Word reached Las Animas that the stage would resume service to Santa Fe within the week. Parker broke the news to Tessa over breakfast one morning while Matthew was outside feeding the chickens. "I see," she said quietly, her face carefully composed. "I should start packing then." Parker's heart sank. He'd hoped for some sign that she was reluctant to leave. "There's no rush," he said. "The stage won't be through until Friday at the earliest." Tessa nodded, pushing her food around her plate. "You've been so kind, Parker. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay." He wanted to say more, to tell her how he felt, but the words stuck in his throat. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if he ruined the friendship they'd built? The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Tessa began to pack her belongings, and Matthew grew increasingly sullen as he realized she really was leaving. Parker threw himself into ranch work, trying to distract himself from the ache in his chest at the thought of the empty space she would leave behind. On Thursday evening, the night before the stage was due, a spring thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes. After Matthew was asleep, Parker found Tessa in the main room, staring out at the storm. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, coming to stand beside her. She glanced up with a sad smile. "I was just thinking how different this is from the blizzard. Same power, different form. Nature's full of contrasts." Parker hesitated, then added, "Like people. Sometimes what looks like strength is really fear in disguise." Tessa turned to face him fully. "What are you afraid of, Parker?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He looked into her eyes, those remarkable green eyes that had haunted his dreams for weeks now, and suddenly the risk of speaking seemed less terrifying than the certainty of silence. "Losing you," he admitted. "Watching you get on that stage tomorrow and knowing I might never see you again." Tessa's breath caught audibly. "Parker, I know it's fast," he rushed on. "I know we've only known each other for a few months, but Tessa, when I found you in that snow, something happened to me. It's like you woke up a part of me I thought had died with Sarah." Tears glistened in her eyes. "I've been so afraid to trust what I was feeling," she whispered. "After James broke our engagement, I promised myself I wouldn't be vulnerable like that again, but you and Matthew, you've become so important to me." Hope bloomed in Parker's chest. Are you saying, I'm saying I don't want to leave, Tessa admitted. But I don't want to be a burden either. I have no dowry, no fortune, just myself to offer. Parker stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes. That's all I want, just you. He reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from her face. When she didn't pull away, he cupped her cheek in his palm. Tessa leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. Stay, Parker murmured. Not as a guest, stay as part of this family. Matthew adores you and I. Tessa, I've fallen in love with you, her eyes opened, shining with emotion. Are you certain? I'm not Sarah. I don't want you to be Sarah, Parker assured her. I loved her and I always will, but what I feel for you is different. It's its own kind of love. Tessa's lips curved into a smile. I love you too, Parker. I think I have since that first night by the fire when you listened to me talk about dreams I thought were long dead. Parker couldn't hold back any longer. He leaned down and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded. Her arms wound around his neck, pulling him closer. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of electricity sparked between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Parker rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes, you'll stay? Tessa laughed, a sound of pure joy. Yes, Parker, I'll stay. The next morning, Parker drove Tessa into Los Animas, not to see her off on the stage, but to send a telegram to her cousin in Santa Fe, explaining her change in plans. They also visited the minister to discuss arrangements for a spring wedding. News traveled fast in a small town like Los Animas. By the time they returned to the ranch, several neighbors had already ridden over to congratulate them, bringing small gifts and well wishes. Matthew's reaction, though, was the most precious. When they told him Tessa was staying for good, that she would be his new mother, the boy threw his arms around her with such force he nearly knocked her over. I knew it, he crowed. I knew you wouldn't leave us. Tessa hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Never, she promised. I'm home now. They were married in early April when the first wildflowers had begun to bloom on the plains. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the Los Animas church with the townspeople and neighboring ranchers in attendance. Tessa wore a simple dress of pale blue silk, a splurge Parker had insisted on, with wildflowers in her hair. Matthew stood proudly as his father's best man, the gold wedding band carefully balanced on a small pillow. As they exchanged vows, Parker couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. If he hadn't ridden out to check his fence line that snowy day, if Tessa hadn't gotten lost in the blizzard, so many small decisions leading to this moment of perfect happiness. I now pronounce you man and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss your bride. Parker didn't hesitate, pulling Tessa close and kissing her to the cheers and applause of their friends. When they broke apart, both were grinning like fools. Mrs. Tessa Thomas, Parker said, testing the name on his tongue. I like the sound of that, she replied, her eyes shining with love. The celebration afterward was lively, with fiddle music, dancing, and plenty of food contributed by the women of Los Animas. Matthew ran about with the other children, periodically returning to check on his father and new mother, as if reassuring himself that they were still there, that this new happiness was real. Late in the evening, as the party began to wind down, Parker found Tessa sitting alone on the porch of the church, gazing up at the stars. Tired of dancing? He asked, taking a seat beside her. She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Just taking a moment to breathe it all in. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find myself back in Boston, or worse, still unconscious in that snowdrift. Parker wrapped his arm around her. This is real, Tessa, we're real. She turned to look at him, her expression suddenly serious. I want you to know that I don't regret a single step of the path that brought me here. Not the loss of my father, not the broken engagement, not even nearly freezing to death. It all led me to you and Matthew. And we're the luckiest men in Colorado territory because of it, Parker said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Spring gave way to summer, and life on the Thomas Ranch flourished. With Tessa's help, Parker expanded his operations, adding more cattle and improving the irrigation system for their crops. Her education and head for figures proved invaluable in managing the business side of things, while Parker focused on the physical work. Matthew thrived under Tessa's guidance, his reading and writing improving dramatically. By late summer, he was devouring books meant for children twice his age, his imagination fired by stories of distant lands and great adventures. In August, as the heat of summer reached its peak, Tessa shared news that filled Parker with wonder and joy. She was expecting a child due in early spring. "Are you pleased?" she asked anxiously after telling him, searching his face for his reaction. Parker laughed, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Pleased? Tessa, I'm ecstatic. Another child, a brother or sister for Matthew, there could be no greater blessing." Matthew was equally excited when they told him, immediately peppering them with questions about the baby and his role as a big brother. He took his new responsibility seriously, insisting on helping Tessa with household chores so she could rest. "The baby needs you to be strong," he told her earnestly. As Tessa's pregnancy progressed, the bond between her and Matthew grew even deeper. The boy had no memory of his birth mother, but he'd clearly yearned for maternal love his whole life. Now he had it in abundance, and he blossomed under Tessa's care. Winter returned to Las Animas, bringing with it memories of the blizzard that had changed their lives. On the anniversary of the day Parker had found Tessa in the snow, they sat together before the fire, Matthew sleeping soundly in his room. "1 year ago today," Parker mused, his hand resting on Tessa's rounded belly. "I almost didn't ride out to check that fence line. And I almost didn't go for that ill-advised walk," Tessa added with a smile. "We were both fools, blessed fools." Parker leaned over to kiss her softly. As his lips met hers, the baby kicked strongly against his palm. They broke apart, laughing. "I think someone feels left out," Tessa said, placing her hand over Parker's. "He's going to be strong like his brother," Parker predicted. They didn't know the baby's gender, of course, but Parker had a feeling it was another boy. Tessa shook her head. "She's going to be stubborn like her father." "Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure," Parker said, his voice husky with emotion. The winter passed without the severe storms of the previous year. In early March, just as the first hints of spring began to appear on the Colorado plains, Tessa went into labor. Unlike the tragedy of Matthew's birth, this delivery was straightforward, if long. The midwife from Las Animas attended, along with 2 neighboring women who had become Tessa's friends. Parker paced outside the bedroom door for hours, Matthew at his side, both of them jumping at every sound from within. When they finally heard the thin wail of a newborn, Parker closed his eyes in relief and gratitude. The midwife emerged, smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Mr. Thomas. You have a healthy son and your wife is doing just fine." Parker entered the bedroom with Matthew close behind. Tessa looked exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle in her arms. She looked up as they approached, her face lighting with love. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Parker sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering down at the tiny red face nestled in the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his mother, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the deep blue of all newborns. "He's perfect," Parker whispered, his voice choked with emotion. He looked up at Tessa. "You're perfect, thank you." Matthew climbed onto the bed for a better look. "He's so small," the boy marveled. "What's his name?" Parker and Tessa exchanged a glance. They discussed names at length but hadn't made a final decision. "What do you think of Samuel?" Tessa suggested. "It means heard by God." Parker nodded, tears pricking his eyes. "Samuel Thomas, it's a good, strong name." Matthew reached out tentatively to touch the baby's hand. Tiny fingers immediately wrapped around his larger one. "Hello, Samuel," he said solemnly. "I'm your big brother." The family of 4 settled into a new routine. The ranch continued to prosper, and Parker was able to hire help for the first time, a young man named Joseph, who had experience with cattle. This allowed Parker more time with his family, especially during those precious early months of Samuel's life. Tessa proved to be as natural a mother with Samuel as she had been with Matthew. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, always finding time for each of her men, as she called them. In the evenings, she would sit in the rocking chair Parker had made for her, Samuel at her breast, listening to Matthew read aloud from his latest book. Parker would watch them from his chair by the fire, his heart full to bursting with love and contentment. By Samuel's first birthday, the Thomas Ranch had nearly doubled in size. The cattle herd was growing, and their crops yielded well despite a dry summer. Parker used some of the profits to add 2 rooms to the house, a larger bedroom for Matthew and a small study for Tessa, where she kept the ranch accounts and indulged her love of reading and writing. Las Animas was growing too, with the arrival of the railroad bringing new settlers and opportunities. Parker occasionally discussed the possibility of expanding further, perhaps adding sheep to their livestock, but he was careful not to overextend. The ranch was profitable now, providing comfortably for their family, and that was enough. On warm summer evenings, they would often sit on the porch after the children were asleep, watching the stars come out over the plains. These were Parker's favorite moments, just him and Tessa, talking quietly about their day, their hopes, their dreams for their sons. "Do you ever miss Boston?" he asked her once. "The theaters, the libraries, all the things a city offers." Tessa considered the question seriously, as she did all questions. "Sometimes I miss certain aspects," she admitted, "but I've never once regretted leaving it behind." She reached for his hand. "Everything I truly need is right here." As the years passed, their love only deepened. There were challenges, of course, drought seasons, illness, the occasional disagreement, but they faced each one together, their partnership stronger for the trials they overcame. Matthew grew into a thoughtful young man with a passion for both books and the land. At 16, he was nearly as tall as Parker, with the same broad shoulders and steady hands. He took on increasing responsibility at the ranch, showing a natural talent for working with the cattle. Samuel, now 10, was more like his mother, quick-witted, observant, with a flair for storytelling that entertained the whole family. He was fascinated by the railroad and the wider world it represented, collecting timetables and maps with the same enthusiasm other boys showed for hunting knives or fishing lures. And there was Elizabeth, their surprise blessing, born when Samuel was 3. At 7, she was the image of Tessa, with the same green eyes and dark hair, but she had Parker's quiet determination. She followed her brothers everywhere, insisting on being included in their activities, and neither boy had the heart to refuse her. One crisp October evening, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a special dinner, Parker raised his glass in a toast. "To my beautiful wife," he said, his eyes fixed on Tessa's face. "10 years ago, you woke up my heart when I thought it would sleep forever." Tessa blinked back tears. "And you saved me from more than just a snowdrift," she replied. "You saved me from a life half-lived." Matthew, now old enough to share a small glass of wine on special occasions, raised his glass as well. "To family," he said simply. Samuel and Elizabeth, with cups of apple cider, eagerly joined the toast, though Elizabeth insisted on adding, "and to many, many more years." Later, after the children were in bed, Parker and Tessa walked hand in hand under the stars. The night was clear and cold, reminiscent of that fateful day 11 winters ago when their paths had crossed in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I am," Parker said, pulling Tessa close against the chill. "That of all the places you could have gotten lost, it was near my fence line." Tessa smiled up at him. "I don't think it was luck, Parker. I think it was destiny." Parker brushed a kiss against her forehead. "Either way, I'm grateful every day." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whicker of horses in the barn, the rustle of the wind through the last leaves clinging to the cottonwoods. "Do you remember what you said when you proposed?" Tessa asked suddenly. "About my waking up a part of you that you thought had died," Parker nodded. "I remember every word of that night. You woke something in me too," she said softly. "Something I didn't even know was sleeping, the ability to trust, to hope, to build a future instead of just surviving the present." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "You didn't just save my life in that snowdrift, Parker Thomas. You gave me a reason to truly live it." Parker's throat tightened with emotion. After 10 years, she could still move him with just a few heartfelt words. "I love you, Tessa Thomas. More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she whispered back, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. Above them, the stars shimmered in the vast Colorado sky. witnesses to a love that had begun in the most desperate of circumstances, but had blossomed into something enduring and true. From unconscious stranger to beloved wife and mother, from lonely widower to contented family man, their journey had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. As they walked back to the house, their home, Parker reflected that some people spend their whole lives searching for the happiness he had found. A family to love, work that satisfied, a place to belong. All because he'd ridden out to check a fence line during a blizzard and found a woman unconscious in the snow. Sometimes, Parker thought, the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges. And sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of a love story waiting to unfold.